Withdrawing our combat troops from Iraq has brought down the cost of that war substantially. Over the last 2 years, we've roughly cut the costs of fighting in Iraq by half. At the same time, we built up our troops in Afghanistan, again, roughly doubling the cost of the war there. So what we're saving in Iraq, we're now spending in Afghanistan, and we may well find that going up further. Ignoring the potential military realities of getting out of Afghanistan by next year, suppose we did save the full $164 billion that CBO has estimated we spent in Iraq and Afghanistan this year. How does that stack up against our budget deficits? If we look at what the budget deficit projections are, CBO says by the middle of this decade, our deficit will run about $500 billion. We'd save about a third of that with saving $164 billion. Not a bad deal, except for the fact that the $500 billion deficit assumes that all the 2001-2003 Bush tax cuts are allowed to expire as scheduled, that the estate tax comes back in its pre-2001 form, taxing estates greater than $1 million, and that the alternative minimum tax becomes effective for roughly 30 million American taxpayers. None of those things is likely to occur, and therefore the budget deficit is likely to be much larger. It's very likely that some or all of the 2001-2003 tax cuts will be extended. The President has called for extending the tax cuts for all but the richest 2 or 3% of Americans. A lot of the Republicans and many others have called for allowing all of the tax cuts to continue, particularly in the face of our economic downturn. So suppose that happens, what happens to our deficit? CBO estimates by the middle of our decade, the deficit will be running not $500 billion a year, but more like $1 trillion a year, and rising in the future. Next to that, $164 billion not spent on wars in Iraq and Afghanistan is fairly small potatoes, only about 1/6 the size of the annual deficit. And while that's real money, $164 billion, nothing to sneeze at, it's certainly not going to solve our budget problems or come anywhere close to closing the budget gap. Well, one problem is with fighting a war over the last decade is that we have used up a lot of what the military has in terms of both personnel and material. There's going to be a lot of need to restock the material and to rebuild our forces. That will occur either on the side of the forces actually used in Iraq and Afghanistan, the material used up there, or in other parts of the military that have been shortchanged during this period of time while money has been spent in the two wars.